Welcome back to a mostly Mopar family. My name is Kelsey, and today we're going to start a series of short videos about this really cool 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner resto mod that you see behind me. This car and I go back about 20 years from when I first found it, and it was difficult to get bought. Once I did buy it, it took a ton of blood, sweat, and tears to get it where you see it today. This thing started out as a clapped out and neglected field car from Great Bend, Kansas. And there were a lot of changes in direction, a lot of changes in scope. It got out of control, as usual for me. But in the end, I'm really happy with the result. And I want to walk you through that process and show you some really cool and trick modifications that were done to this car. The next couple episodes will focus on things like the engine, transmission, suspension, brakes, and fabrication aspects of the car, but today's focus will be on how I found the car and the purchase. Before we get started, if you like this episode, please do me a huge favor, like and subscribe. I first found this car in the summer of either 2002 or 2003. I was a broke college kid, but I was still looking for something cheap and something fun, and back then you could still do it, because as I was browsing this newspaper, I found an ad for a 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner 383 4-speed car for, get this, brace yourselves, $1,500. Those prices seem insane compared to today's pricing, but this was the early 2000s, and this was not out of the ordinary. I called the owner up. His name was Brad, and Brad was a garage door repairman. Brad found all kinds of stuff as a garage door repairman, because guess what? He was in people's garages all the time, and he bought literally hundreds of cars, not just Mopar muscle cars. He bought all brands, any kind of cool muscle car you can imagine. He bought and sold them. He bought a field full of Mopar B-bodies from a guy in Great Bend, Kansas. He bought 40 of them for $400 a piece in a package deal, and he was ready to turn and burn. He was just making trips every day, Great Bend, Newton, Great Bend, Newton, and he was trying to move these cars as quick as he could, get his money back, and just make some quick money. By the time I had worked a full day, gotten home, seen the newspaper ad, and actually gotten a hold of Brad, it was pretty late in the evening, at least 8:30, but Brad was a night owl and he was working late. So he invited me to come over to his building on the west side of town and take a look at the '69 Roadrunner. When I walked in the door though, I was blown away because there were tons of Mopar B-bodies in there. I didn't know that he had bought 40 cars, but there were Roadrunners, Satellites, Superbees, GTXs. Almost any B-body you can imagine was crammed into this little building. Brad took me over to the 1969 Roadrunner and I looked it over. And although it was a complete car with its original 383 4-barrel engine and 4-speed manual transmission, for some reason I was fixated on the rust on the quarter panels and it really turned me off. The back half of the car was a bit rusty, but man, I should have bought it. What was I thinking? But I did become fixated with this 1968 Roadrunner post that was sitting right next to it. With the two sitting side by side, this car looked a lot more solid and straight than that 69 did. And I did look it over, but it was missing a lot. It was missing the original transmission, front seat, and the entire front clip of the car. No front fenders, no hood, no grille, no valance, no radiator. The original engine was there, but it had been open to the elements, so it was junk. But I asked Brad, what do you want for this car? And he said, I want $1,500 for it too, because it's more solid. I looked at it and I said, would you take $1,200? He said, yeah, I could do that. Now, it's after 9 o'clock at night and I hadn't been able to go to the bank because I hadn't seen the ad until after the bank closed. So I said, Brad, I'll be back tomorrow afternoon after work. I'll pick this car up and I'll pay you then. He said, okay, we'll see you then. The next day at work, I was on cloud 9 because all I could think about was this Roadrunner and I was super psyched to pick it up. The end of the day couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I made a beeline to the bank, picked up the cash, and I drove over to Brad's place. But when I walked in the front door and looked around, the Roadrunner and several other cars were all gone. I found Brad and said, "Hey, Brad, did you move the Roadrunner?" He said, "No, a guy from Salina showed up and he bought 6 Mopar B bodies from me, but he really wanted that Roadrunner. So since he was buying so many cars, I let him have it." Man, I can't tell you how bummed out I was. I was super bummed out, but I learned some really valuable lessons from this. First of all, it wasn't a good time for me to be buying the car anyway. I couldn't have finished it. I would have had to sell it. And second of all, I didn't put money down on the car. Now, the deal kind of caught me by surprise, but it taught me, don't ever show up to buy a car unless you've got cash in hand and a trailer ready to go. The funny thing is, Brad and I interacted a lot more over the next couple of years, and we actually struck up a really good friendship. I kind of ended up hanging out over there just because of all the cool Mopars he had coming through, and I learned an awful lot from him. And that friendship is still going on today. So fast forward about 9 or 10 years, and I've been at my job for about 5 or 6 years at this point, and I'm getting some money together, and I'm really starting to look more seriously for a Mopar project. But this Roadrunner is still kind of hanging in the back of my mind. And one day I called Brad up and I said, "Hey Brad, do you remember the name of the guy or any information about the purchaser of that Roadrunner?" And he said, "Well, his name was Mike. I do remember that. And I think he worked at a body shop or maybe owned a body shop in Salina, but he did something with body work." Well, I was feeling ambitious, so I got on Google, looked up body shops, and I started cold calling all these shops in Salina. And eventually, I found the shop that Mike worked at. He actually owned the shop. When I talked to Mike, I told him about the Roadrunner and told him I was still interested, and I asked him if he'd done anything with it. He hadn't. He actually had quite a few Mopars at his place, and he had collected some parts for the Roadrunner. He'd found some fenders, a hood, a grill, but that was about it. The car had been sitting inside his Morton building for the last 9 or 10 years, and he hadn't really dug into it at all. So I asked if he was interested in selling, and he said, yeah, he was. We set up a time for me to go up to Smolin and take a look at the car. And when I pulled up, we went to his Morton building, and there sat the car, just like I remembered it, except it had a few extra parts on it now. Mike and I walked around this car. We also walked around several other cars that he had sitting around the place. He also had a 1968 Plymouth GTX that was also red, and it was originally a 4-speed Dana 60 car, and this same GTX had been at Brad's place as well. I ended up making a deal for the 1968 Roadrunner, a 1969 GTX, and a super ratty 1968 Roadrunner parts car. I only had a 1-car trailer, so I made 3 trips to haul those 3 cars from Smolin back to Newton, and I pulled a few parts off of the Roadrunner parts car and off the GTX. I got titles for all 3 cars because none of them had a title, and I sold the GTX and the Roadrunner parts car. The structure underneath this car was excellent. Both rockers, the torsion bar crossmember, and rear frame rails were all in excellent condition, especially for a car that had been sitting in a field for so many years. My original plan was to keep it simple, get a 383 and a 4-speed manual, and to just go have fun with the car. But apparently I can't do simple. It never stays simple, and things get out of control really quickly. In the next episode, we'll be talking about some of the sheet metal fixes and surprises that found us on this car. We'll also be talking about the early drivetrain direction. I hope you can join me.